They thought ambulances were wagons with stretchers. They weren't. They were a system: ownership, signal, drill, routes, authority, and records, stitched together under fire until the Army of the Potomac could do something most armies do poorly: find the wounded fast, move them safely, sort them calmly, and keep them alive long enough for skill to matter. They called it removal. It was rescue designed as procedure. This is how Jonathan Letterman turned chaos into a chain and taught a modern army to carry its wounded from the line to a future measured in days they might get to see. The early war answered pain with improvisation. Regiments marched with no standard ambulance equipment and no single officer who owned the problem. Civilians came when they could. Teamsters did what Teamsters do: protect teams and wagons first, and surgeons fought two wars at once: the enemy's weapons and their own transport. Men crawled to fence lines and shade trees as if shade were medicine. They waited for a friend with a canteen, a chaplain with a prayer, a stranger with a borrowed cart. Some bled to death softly because the army did not yet own the first hour. Some lived long enough to die of shock because the second hour belonged to confusion. The battle decided who fell. The system decided who rose again. The early system had no owner. Jonathan Letterman walked into that vacancy in the summer of 1862 and treated it not as a tragedy, but as a design brief. He was not the first good surgeon in this war. He was the first to make the road to the surgeon part of surgery. He believed the line between life and death often ran through a ditch, a ravine, a muddy lane, and a tangle of wheels. So he did the unfashionable thing. He wrote policies, appointed owners, set drills, drew routes, and borrowed a quartermaster's mind for a medical purpose. The result looked boring from a distance: flags, wagons, litters, paperwork. Up close, it was the difference between a battlefield and a slaughter field. Letterman's core idea was simple: control the chain end to end. First mile, litter-bearers who were trained, uniformed, and assigned, not volunteers wandering with courage. Second mile, ambulances that belonged to the medical department, not to line commanders who might seize them for saddles and stew. Third mile, dressing stations as near to the fight as a pulse would allow, not improvised under every dramatic tree. Fourth mile, division hospitals with surgeons sorted by aptitude: quick hands for amputations, steady hands for ligatures, careful hands for records, and a commissary for the wounded that issued food, water, and clean linen as if they mattered equal to scalpels and needles. Final mile, evacuation routes back to railheads, river landings, and general hospitals where the longer work began. The chain was not new in theory. It was new because it had ownership at each link and orders that stuck. He began with people because plans without people are speeches. Regiment by regiment, he took bandsmen and detailed men as litter-bearers and taught them a trade: how to move into fire, how to kneel, how to lift, how to move a man who could breathe but not walk, how to move a man who could not breathe well enough to ride, how to read a face for shock when words kept their secrets. He gave them officers who wore responsibility as clearly as they wore rank. He drilled them in the dull, saving motions: secure the limb, steady the head, avoid twisting the spine, move on the count, carry low when the ground lies, higher when the ground lies to you. He took courage and turned it into muscle memory. Ambulances had been everyone's and no one's. Letterman made them the medical department's and no one else's. That one change did more for survival than sermons. If a general could seize an ambulance to move bread or ammunition, the wounded would watch wheels roll away without them. If a teamster could ignore a surgeon's signal, the litter bearers became porters for a promise. So Letterman created an ambulance corps with rank, accountability, and drill. He standardized signals, a flag, a bugle call, a visible right-of-way that men learned to respect because someone taught them to, and someone else wrote down what happened when they didn't. He wrote routes on maps, forward lanes for empty ambulances, return lanes for full, a one-way system for pain that prevented collisions of panic and good intention. He put a captain in charge of each division's corps and made that captain answer for every axle and mule. Dressing stations were his first hospitals, not for surgery, for sorting, wound, bleeding, breathing, those three truths in that order. Hemorrhage first, airway second, shock always. Surgeons worked with what would travel: water, lint, bandage, a tourniquet that would not forget its knot, a dose to quiet terror when quiet meant less bleeding. The station's job was not glory, it was triage. Decide quickly, touch correctly, hand off safely. Some men returned to the line. Some went back as soon as a bandage and a word could make it possible. Some lay under a tree a little longer until breath remembered its rhythm. The station held the chaos at arm's length long enough for the ambulances to make order possible. The division hospital turned blood and will into work that counted. This was where amputations saved the living by sacrificing limbs already lost to infection and shattered bone. This was where chloroform proved that mercy and efficiency are not enemies. This was where instruments finally found a clean table and hands found water that did not come from a puddle. Records began to look like records, not letters written against a knee. A commissary issued broth, bread, coffee, and rest as if a ration were therapy, which, in war, it is. No miracles, just an organized defiance of the obvious. Men who might have died from delay lived because the chain flowed instead of jammed. He wrote a supply table for the wounded that resembled a quartermaster's plan: bandages by the thousand, lint by the bale, tourniquets by the dozen, chloroform cans counted and recounted, splints sized for the common breaks, bed sacks and straw to turn a floor into something a man's back could call mercy, carts for water, kettles for soup, lanterns for night work. He did not despise details because details add up to hours, and hours add up to days a man may get to see. Battle tests a system faster than policy does. The Maryland campaign and Antietam became a laboratory you would never wish for but dare not ignore. Before Letterman, the wounded might have waited for daylight to notice them. Under Letterman, bearers moved as the line moved, ambulances knew where they could safely approach, and division hospitals were chosen with an eye to access and egress, close enough to save time, far enough to save the hospital itself. Men still suffered. No plan erases war. But the map of suffering shifted. Fewer men died where they had fallen. More men died under a roof with a name on a ledger and a friend within earshot. That may sound small. It is not. A death with pain reduced and panic removed is mercy. A survival produced by a timely lift is policy becoming breath. Fredericksburg taught humility to every plan. Streets turned to killing grounds. Stone walls mocked courage. The river crossed and recrossed while ambulances searched for lanes that did not exist on the day they were needed. Yet even under that punishment, the system's bones held. The wounded flowed from curb and field to station to hospital to the far bank. The red and the green, banners for places where a man could expect dressing and survival, became part of the Army's vocabulary. The Sanitary Commission and the Christian Commission, civilians with organization on their lips and useful hands on their wagons, met the system without colliding with it, because Letterman understood that a public plan must make room for private mercy. He gave them places where their strength multiplied the chain's strength instead of tangling it. Chancellorsville proved that surprise hurts systems too. A flank collapse produces not only retreat, but confusion in the backfield. Ambulances heading forward into a new front, bearers looking for a command post that has turned into a gap. The ambulance corps' value showed in reverse. Where it already existed, it recovered faster. The habit of marching in lanes and reporting to one captain made the Corps behave like a single tool instead of a scatter of good intentions. A system that can recover its own order is worth more than a system that performs perfectly until it doesn't. Gettysburg was the exam no one wanted. 3 days of fighting across ridges, farms, rock, and heat wrote a demand signal that would have broken the early war ad hoc. Letterman's chain bent. It did not break. Dressing stations sprang where they had to. Division hospitals gathered in barns and houses chosen for access to water and roads. Ambulances cycled like blood, empty forward, full back, then forward again. Water carts became as precious as ammunition. Chloroform cans wore dents where hands reached too often. Surgeons triaged with the cruelty compassion sometimes requires. Those who could wait, waited. Those who could not, did not. The table work went on by lamplight until hands cramped, and then went on again. 3 days after the guns fell quiet, the field did not look like abandonment. It looked like an organized exhaustion. There were still failures, there always are, but the scale of success measured itself in letters home. Letterman taught the Army to read time differently. The hour after wounding became the most valuable hour in the world. He acted as if it belonged to him, and then he made it so. He did that by appointing owners for that hour. The stretcher team that owns the first 10 minutes, the ambulance captain who owns the first mile, the dressing station surgeon who owns the decision, the hospital steward who owns the transfer, the clerks who own the names that might otherwise vanish. When everyone owns a piece of the hour responds. It slows down just enough for life to fit through. He wrote discipline into the wagons. Each ambulance carried basic dressings, water, and blankets. Each crew knew its station area and the line it served. Mules were counted as if they were instruments, because on that day they were. Teams rotated so that the animals did not die of the very generosity that made them good. Wheels were greased on a schedule. Axles and pins were inspected at dawn, not after they failed at noon. A broken linchpin is not drama. It is a man's life, measured in yards he will not travel. Letterman treated every small part that way. He standardized signals. A flagged station meant a known service. A bugle meant route priority. A placard on an ambulance meant the unit it served and the captain who would answer if it did not appear where it should. Surgeons logged the time of arrival because time was a metric, not a rumor. If a company's wounded took too long to reach a station, the captain and the bearer sergeant walked the ground in daylight and wrote a new route before night, and battle forgot their lesson. The system learned from itself because it looked at itself on paper. The plan respected terrain. Routes bent around ravines and along stone walls where musketry dropped to nuisance. Stations hid behind knolls and farm buildings that shaded bodies and steadied nerves. Hospitals sat by water, springs first, wells second, barrels and carts when nothing else would do. Lanes dried faster where they were crowned. The Corps learned to carry shovels because a 6-inch trench can turn a swamp into a road tomorrow. No general order can conjure a dry road. A habit of small engineering can. Letterman understood that surgeons are not interchangeable. He assigned the fast to the table when speed saved, the meticulous to ligatures and the quiet repairs a body can keep, the clear-eyed to triage where a moment's hesitation could steal a life from someone else. He promoted stewards who could keep a tent running when sleep went missing, who could write the day down as evidence that the system still had a memory. He protected the best from being dragged into errands. In a crisis, every good pair of hands is a temptation. A chief who hoards his best people for their rightful tasks is not arrogant. He is faithful to the plan. Pain management was not an afterthought. Chloroform was issue, not miracle. Opium and laudanum were tools applied with knowledge that mercy should not become a second enemy. The goal was less panic, less shock, fewer men remembering every second of a blade. An army that treats pain as a variable it can influence is an army that stays human under strain. That humanness paid off in a quieter field and a steadier hand at the table. Infection taught lessons no plan can skip. Clean water near the knife saved lives that courage alone could not. Boiled instruments spoke a language that surgeons would not fully formalize until after this war, but the instinct lived here. Wash, rinse, wipe, change linen, keep flies at bay, clear waste. A hospital is a city that can sicken itself if it forgets its drains. Letterman's hospitals tried not to forget. He designated latrine lines with wind and runoff in mind, placed awful pits where water would not change its mind in a storm, and posted sentries over the unglamorous. The enemy was not only across the fence, it was in the ditch beside the tent. He trained men to see it. The evacuation piece turned battlefield success into survival. Railheads and river landings became extensions of the hospital rather than interruptions. Letterman laid down a rhythm. Dress, stabilize, move. He asked for cars reserved for lying wounded when possible, for straw renewed before it became filth, for a steward to ride with each batch so that records and bodies traveled together. He wanted a man to arrive with his name, his condition, and his chance intact. When water routes were better than iron, he worked the river, slow, steady, shaded, with the motion that lulls pain better than any road. Moving wounded is not just transport, it is care done at speed. Civilians mattered and were made to matter better. The United States Sanitary Commission brought supplies and a bureaucracy that understood forms as acts of mercy. The Christian Commission brought words men wanted to hear and hands men needed to hold. Letterman set boundaries and doors. Come this far, do this kind of work, hand this to that steward, keep this lane clear, report this shortage there. He was not rude. He was ruthless for the wounded. When volunteer energy meets a plan, the plan must be strong enough to digest it. He built digestion into the map. He argued for rank for medical officers that meant something. In a peacetime army, a surgeon's authority can be confined to his tent. In wartime, his orders must reach a wheel on a road. Letterman's regulations made a surgeon's word a command to a teamster and a path that civilians had to respect. He did not want debates at the mouth of a lane. He wanted motion at the tempo of survival. Where the plan was enforced, motion won more often than arguments. Letterman wrote after action without theater. He named failures quietly and fixes plainly. A station too far forward invited capture, too far back invited hemorrhage. An ambulance park placed in soft ground became a casualty. A surgeon who mistook triage for theater found himself reassigned to a table where speed could save him from himself. He did not invent brilliance where habit would do. He invented habit where vacancy killed. His reports read like a man who had learned to love boring outcomes because boring outcomes hide 100 small good decisions. The men under his system noticed. They wrote home about how quickly they were found, about the taste of coffee before the knife, about the way a hand on a shoulder steadied the world when the world smelled of iron. They wrote about a man who came back to the company with less of a leg and more of a story than a headstone ever gives. They wrote about a chain that felt like respect. Respect is fuel. An army that feels respected stays in the traces on days when nothing seems to go forward. The ambulance corps, invisible to glory, fed that reservoir daily. This was not perfection. Nothing in war is. There were days the system collapsed under sudden weather or ground that refused to cooperate, or leaders who forgot the cartography of mercy. There were nights too dark and mornings too quick. There were prisoners who did not get the benefit of the chain until policy learned to carry grace across lines. There were times when the army moved faster than the wagons could, and men lay where they fell longer than they should have. Letterman's genius was not that he prevented failure. It was that he reduced its frequency and its cruelty. He taught a grammar the army kept. Dressing station, division hospital, general hospital became a sentence men could say out loud with their eyes closed. Bugle, flag, lane became punctuation that prevented collisions. Steward, clerk, record became memory. Mule, wheel, pin became detail. There is a dignity in a chain that works under pressure. It tells the private that the general cares not only whether he was brave at noon, but whether he will be alive at dusk. That sentence kept being written, and its subject survived inside thousands of quiet victories no headline bothered to name. The system also saved surgeons. Before Letterman, a good surgeon could drown in men he could not reach in time, working on the wrong case because the right case never arrived, or losing men to thirst and panic he could not treat with a knife. After Letterman, the table was fuller, but so was the hour. Men arrived bandaged, quieter, warmer, with their names pinned to their coats and their prospects stated in a line a clerk could read. A surgeon's skill multiplied when the wounded arrived sorted. Medicine feels like art until logistics allows it to be science. Then it becomes both. The war taught him more, and he taught it back. Heat meant more water carts, more canvas for shade, and less bravado about marching wounded. Cold meant firewood allocation, straw management, and vigilance against the small infections that become big when blood moves slowly. Rain meant road work and patience. Dust meant more coughs, more thirst, more gauze. Each weather is an enemy with a polite introduction. The ambulance corps learned to greet it with a list and an adjustment. Letterman's regulations traveled beyond his person. He moved on from the Army of the Potomac. The chain did not forget his voice. Other armies looked at the results and borrowed without apology. The Confederate side learned many of the same lessons under different pressures and with fewer mules and rails to carry them. Pain teaches across lines. By the war's end, the idea that an army would have an organized ambulance service with authority and drill had become an assumption you would not want to test in the breach. Assumptions are expensive to build and cheap to lose. This one, built with routine and stubborn compassion, outlived the regiments that first saw its flags. Follow one stretcher for a mile, and you will understand a book of regulations better than by reading it. The bearers bend, look, lift. One counts time because time is strength. The other counts steps because steps are distance. The man on the litter hears their voices and chooses to believe them. They do not promise the impossible, they promise the next 30 paces. The ambulance waits with wheels slightly chalked, team heads down, harness quiet. The surgeon at the station does not talk about heroism. He talks about breath and pulse, pressure and cloth. The ambulance rolls on a lane that another man walked yesterday to find the soft places and the ruts. At the hospital, the steward meets them with a nod that says, "We've been expecting you," which is the kindest sentence a wounded man can hear. None of this is exciting to watch. It is thrilling to survive. Standardization was the quiet star. A splint that fits a fracture without whittling saves minutes. A stretcher that locks into a wagon bed saves knuckles and spines. A kit packed the same way across 30 ambulances saves a surgeon's mind when his hands are busy. A form with blanks in the same place at every station saves names. War tempts improvisation as a lifestyle. Letterman made improvisation a last resort. Creativity happened where it belonged, in the face of the unknown, not in the face of the routine. Records mattered because they turned compassion into memory. A name on a card, a wound described in a hand the family could read, a date that anchors fear, a place where a letter can find a bed, that is, administration as love. Too grand a word, perhaps, but the truth hides in it. When an army brings its wounded back into the ledger, it tells them that they have not left the nation when they left the line. That promise carries men forward when the next march asks more than yesterday did. Transportation beyond the field linked the chain to the country. Hospital trains became classrooms in their own right. Orderlies who learned that water spills on curves, so you do not fill the buckets to the brim, that lamps need trimming at stations chosen for light as much as for coal. That straw becomes foul in a day unless you treat it like a patient. Hospital steamers learn to moor where the gangway opens into a corridor wide enough for litters, where the galley can produce broth at all hours, where the deck's shade is worth more than conversation. Moving wounded is a craft. The war taught men to practice it with pride. Letterman did not hate volunteers. He welcomed them with a rule book. The difference shows in emergencies. A volunteer with direction is force multiplied. A volunteer without it is a good story attached to a clogged lane. He learned to say, "Not here, there," and to say it in the voice of a man who knows what both places mean. Authority in the service of mercy must be both gentle and absolute. He practiced being both. He built in redundancy. When one lane failed, another opened because some officer had been made responsible for imagining a failure in daylight. When a station was overrun, a second had already been flagged in a safer place. When a hospital ran short of water, a cart line had already been marked to a spring a mile away. Redundancy is expensive on quiet days and priceless on loud ones. He paid in attention early so that the Army could pay in blood later a little less. The moral arithmetic was considered. A well-run ambulance corps does not make war gentle. It makes it survivable. There is a difference. Survivability increases a nation's will to persist when musketry and artillery try to harvest it. That is not a small strategic effect. Men march better when they believe someone will carry them back. Families wait better when they trust that their sons are in a system, not a rumor. The enemy learns a lesson, too. You are fighting not a line of men, but a country that brings its wounded home as a matter of procedure. Procedure is terrifying when you are on the wrong side of it. There were critics, of course. Some believed ambulances too near the line invited faint-heartedness. Letterman answered with a statistic without numbers. Find me a man who fights less hard because he sees a wagon that will not reach him unless he falls. Find me a commander whose courage grows when he knows half his wounded will be lost in the dust. He did not shout. He drew maps and showed improvements and let the results persuade men who loved results. He made peace with the unavoidable. There would be days when mud claims wheels faster than men can dig, when a creek decides to be a river, when a farm lane becomes a trap, when a regiment falls back over its own stations. On those days, the command is simple. Save who can be saved without asking permission. He had taught enough men to make that sentence a habit. Habits rescue plans when plans meet weather. Letterman's legacy is visible every time a modern unit drills casualty evacuation with a clarity that would have been science fiction when this war began. Sectors, lanes, triage tags, evacuation priorities, pain management, records, staged resupply. Rehearse the route, rehearse it again. Run the plan when you do not need it so your bones remember it when your head cannot. He wrote that into an army not by poetry, but by paper, by inspection, and by the cheerless courage of repetition. The story is not about one man after all, though it wears his name because names give credit where it is due. It is about an idea that nations forget at their peril. Care is logistics. If you do not own the first hour after wounding, the enemy will. If you do not appoint owners for the mile between the smoke and the surgeon's lantern, fate will. If you do not treat the mule and the axle like scalpels, you will talk about heroism at funerals and forget the shape of mercy that was within reach. He taught this without preaching. He simply ordered wagons to stand where men could find them and organized hands so that they would be ready to lift. If you want one image to keep this. A field after the fire slackens. A few shots pop like distant doors. The bearers move in a line with deliberate speed. One speaks, always the same way. We have you. The wounded man believes him because the sentence belongs to a chain that has not broken today. The ambulance waits like a quiet promise. The station flag stirs. The hospital tent is not a mystery. It is a destination. The route has been walked. The water has been boiled. The ledger has a line for a name that is still being spoken. That, in a war that swallowed promises, is as close to justice as many men received. They thought ambulances were wagons with stretchers. They were not. They were policy at speed, mercy on a schedule, discipline under a flag, and the stubborn insistence that the first hour belongs to the living if someone reaches for it in time. Letterman reached, and a nation learned how to help. Annex, the ladder of care. The ladder had 4 rungs that men learned to feel under their hands, even when they could not see them. First rung, the dressing station, closest to the line that safety allows. It is where bleeding stops and breath is watched. Water is medicine, and so is shade. Second rung, the field hospital at Division, where decision lives. This is where a surgeon says yes to the knife or no with equal courage. It is where shock is fought with blankets, broth, and measured doses, where pain is managed, where records anchor a person to his army. Third rung, evacuation by road, rail, or water, where movement is care. A rough road negates a good operation, a smooth movement saves a marginal case. Fourth rung, the general hospital, where days are added. The latter works only if every rung is owned. Letterman appointed owners and made them answer for wood, water, and time, with the same seriousness with which others answered for gunpowder. Annex, the bearer drill. It is not instinct to lift well under fire. Instinct freezes, flinches, rushes, drops. Drill forbids those and trades them for kneel, assess, secure, lift on count, step together, watch the ground, rest before you falter, speak to the man. The voice is not poetry. It is metronome and medicine. We have you. Breathe. Almost there. Hold still. Counting up. Every bearer learns to make his voice a bridge a man can cross while his body argues with him. The drill includes the ugly calculus of triage at the edge of smoke. Who moves now? Who moves after? Who waits under a canteen and a promise because moving him now will kill 2 men later? Drill teaches men to carry that weight without writing it on their faces. Annex, stations as small cities. A station has districts: clean water corner, waste trench, shade, light, quiet, and the inevitable noisy edge where men arrive. It has traffic rules. It has posted hours, as required. It has trades: surgeons, stewards, cooks, carpenters, water carriers, clerks. It has a customs house, the records table, where each arrival pays the tax of a name and a note. It has police, the bearer sergeant, who says where to put what and moves men away from where their good intentions would do harm. A station that looks like nothing is wrong has probably learned this grammar. A station that looks busy is learning it today and will appear calm tomorrow. Annex, the language of flags and bugles. You cannot shout a plan over cannon. Flags mean here and safe enough and this service. Bugles mean make way or clear this. Lane or ambulances forward. The plan chose signals that could not be confused with infantry calls. It rehearsed them. It punished ignorance with instruction, not with pride. When you see a wagon move through men who have no reason to be polite in that hour and yet are, you are seeing the social contract of an army working. That contract is made of food, pay, purpose, and a promise about what happens if you fall. Signals keep the promise audible when ears are ringing. Annex, the commissary for the wounded. Food is medicine when the body is deciding whether to go into shock. Broth arrives before questions. Coffee appears where sleep has fled. Bread that a man can chew without breaking teeth is not luxury. It is a way to persuade his stomach to agree with his heart. A steward who keeps a kettle going does not figure in dramatic accounts. He figures in survival rates. Letterman put such men on the map. He measured their worth in the quietest numbers an army ever collects: men who sleep, men who wake, men who stabilize. Annex, night. The ambulance corps is a creature of light when it must be, and dark when it should be. Night noises demand discipline. Lamps must be shaded, positioned, lanterns hung where hands will be and not where eyes want to look. A station whispers because sound carries in strange ways when the guns pause. Routes are walked in the afternoon to learn the roots and stones that will trip a tired man at midnight. The night steward learns to listen for the breath that falters and to find the hand with water before fear finds a story. Night is when a plan's maintenance shows. If you did not stack straw, you will hear coughing. If you did not dig a trench, you will smell regret. If you did not mark a lane, you will feel wreckage. Letterman taught men to pay the bill in daylight. Annex. Weather. Heat is a thief that steals from the wounded more than from the well. Shade becomes triage. Water becomes doctrine. Cold makes small injuries loud. A chilled man bleeds longer and shivers pain into panic. Straw is strategy. Rain is a liar that calls a road a lake and tells you it always was one. Boards in a wagon bed are not luxury when wheels begin to throw mud like insults. Wind is a messenger. Stations move out of it if they can. Shelters lean into it when they must. The Corps learned to read clouds like orders. Annex. Failures named and mended. There were captured stations because flags must fly near risk. There were routes that promised firmness and delivered swamp. There were officers who loved their own decisions more than the plan. Each failure wrote a short book. The next week read it and changed a line on a map or a name on a roster. In an army that loves tradition, the ambulance corps learned the right tradition. Change what hurts the wounded first. Annex. The aftermath. The battle ends and the work begins. Fields are searched with the same care the Corps once took to find firewood. Graves detail parties, often the same bearers who carried life yesterday. The station's ledger becomes the family's letter. The quartermaster comes for wagons. The medical department holds two longer because men still lie in shade who have not decided whether to live. The army moves. The Corps has to move faster. It folds its hospitals as a tent folds, cleans its kettles, burns what must not sicken the next week, and rolls. The map follows and redraws itself on a new farm. A good Corps leaves behind only memory and kindness owed. Annex. The lesson for anyone who plans to ask people for courage. Do not ask men to be brave and then abandon the hour after they fall. Own that hour with the same authority you use to own the hour of attack. Put a captain over every lane of mercy and give him the power to wave a general to the side when a wagon must pass. Count water barrels as carefully as cartridges. Teach your clerks to spell under pressure. Hang your flags where the sun can find them. Drill your bearers until the verbs live in their hands. Make the chain boring. Boring chains hold when exciting plans fail. Letterman gave an army that gift. He saved men by the thousands, one practiced minute at a time. They thought ambulances were wagons with stretchers. They were not. They were the promise that the living would be helped to stay living by design and by habit. They were the sound of a plan approaching across ruts. They were a flag that meant someone was paying attention. They were a schedule that argued with death and sometimes won. That is a revolution worth remembering every time the smoke moves and the first hour begins again.